Well, we have to ask first what it is. There is a classical mind-body problem, basically Cartesian. Uh, Descartes famously postulated res cogitans alongside of res extensa. So there's extended entity that's matter, physical, material. Then there's the mental world, which is separate from that. Look for some connection between them. That was a perfectly reasonable scientific hypothesis, nothing mystical about it. Descartes, like all scientists of the period from Galileo through Newton and beyond, adopted what was called the mechanical philosophy, the idea that the world is a complex artifact, sort of like the artifacts that skilled artisans were producing at the time, quite very extensively all over Europe. Skilled artisans were producing mechanical clocks that could do all sorts of complicated things. The fountain, the gardens at Versailles, as you walk through them, all kind of things were happening, and playing things that looked like people playing a role in plays and so on. And then Galileo, his contemporaries, and others, Leibniz, Newton concluded, well, that's what the world is, just a complicated system, but basically mechanical, gears, levers, things pushing and pulling each other, and so on. Descartes just routinely assumed that, everyone did. And then Descartes tried to show that, well, his main scientific work was to try to show that, in fact, you could give a mechanical explanation for phenomena of the world, including a good deal of human understanding, behavior, of sensation and perception. He thought he could give a mechanical interpretation of that. But he observed that some things don't fall within that. In fact, one of his main examples in the Discourse on Method was language. He said, if you look at what people are doing there, there's no mechanical interpretation for what you and I are now doing. It's maybe impelled by circumstances, but not compelled by them. You could choose differently, and you choose appropriately. So somehow people are making appropriate, undetermined use of language in ways that we could call creative. It's a long history behind this. He wasn't the first to point it out. But then, like any scientist, he postulated a principle to account for this. That's the second principle, res cogitans. That's the classical non-body problem. Well, it was the props were knocked under it by Newton, who didn't say anything about the mind, but he showed that the mechanical system is not true, showed the world is not a mechanical system. That's one of the main contents of Newton's Principia, is to undermine, to show that Descartes' proofs just didn't work. He'd had no account of the universe in mechanical terms. In fact, there isn't any. Newton postulated principles that are outside the mechanical world. Newton himself regarded this as a total absurdity. He didn't believe a word of it. He said, nobody of any scientific understanding can believe this, but it seems to be true. And that's why he never wrote a book on science, what would have been called at the time principles of philosophy. He never wrote that. He wrote mathematical principles. That's just an account of what happens, but without any explanation. His famous comment, I make no hypotheses, is because he said, I have no physical explanation. I can just say, here's the way it works. Here's the mathematical principles. Well, that ended the mind-body problem in the classical sense. Until somebody says tells us what matter is, nobody can tell that up to the present day, and there's no mind-body problem in the classical sense. This was understood, incidentally, like John Locke, immediately after the appearance of Principia, pointed out that he put it in a theological framework, standard framework of the day. And he said, just as Newton has shown, God assigned properties to matter that we cannot conceive of. He said, similarly, God may have superadded to matter the principles of thought. In other words, thought is just some form of organized matter where we don't know what matter is, but whatever it turns out to be, the tides, the planets, so on, they follow it by principles we can't understand, but we can work with them, and maybe thought is the same. That was pursued very extensively through the 18th century by leading figures. They reached its peak with Joseph Priestley, chemist, philosopher, at the end of the 18th century. It was quite extensive studies of how thought can be a property of organized matter. Then it was pretty much forgotten, rediscovered in the late 20th century without any knowledge of the history, and it's now considered part of philosophy and neuroscience, but comes straight out of the collapse of the mind-body problem. Well, is there another mind-body problem? Well, commonly these days, the mind-body problem is formulated in totally different terms, unrelated to the classical one. It's usually formulated in terms of first person versus third person conceptions of the world. So the first person conception is what I sense. The moon's big on the horizon. That's first person. The third person approach is what the scientist from the outside says about it. If you pursue that, you get different conclusions. Some people call that a mind-body problem. I think that's a very bad term for it. And I think that's just a misformulation of the way we should look at the problem. There's interesting work on this, including a recent book by an Australian philosopher, a very good one, Peter Slezak. I think it's called The Cartesian Illusion or something like that. The Cartesian amphitheater or something like that. But that's now something like that is often called the mind-body problem, which it shouldn't be, in my opinion. There was the scientific question, which essentially was resolved by Newton. There's no body, there's no matter, there's no physical, so there's no mind-body problem.